But notice what you've just said. If you decide, then you give meaning to your life, right? So it takes character, it takes resilience to say, despite this, whatever it might be, a car accident, a divorce, a shooting, disease, I'm not giving up. All right, so I'll perhaps lead in by saying, in our previous interview, we got to a branch point where I remarked that after my doctorate, I really needed a job. I had no money, and I decided to apply to work in the Department of Defence. There's a whole other story I said about what then occurred, but we didn't go into exploring that story, and we never got back to it. Instead, we went back to the question of the manifesto I'd written for myself in 1975, and explored how my personal life had unfolded from there. So this morning we thought we might go back and revisit this question about, so when I applied to defence, having spent all those years in university studying, how did that play out?
And had you at that point accepted that this path of going on to, you'd had these offers to Harvard and so on, and then you weren't able to pursue that because you didn't have the funds? And I think I remember you telling me at some point there was this idea of, studying classics and becoming an academic. Had you just seen like that's not possible for me because the people who can do that need backing from family or from somewhere else, and for you were going to have to leave academia and get a job?
Yeah, essentially. So just to pick up quickly on that point about classics, that goes back to my undergraduate years when I did classics in translation in first and second years. Classics in translation means I was studying the classical world but without doing Greek or Latin, right, which is an option that the classics department had opened up in order to draw more students in, right? And I topped the course in both years, and so the professor of Greek took me aside, George Gelly, and he said, you've got better results in classics in first and second year than anybody else in recent memory, and we would love to see you go on and do a DPhil at Cambridge in classics, right? So I could have preceded you to Cambridge under that scenario, and I said to him, of course he explained, he said, but in order to do that, you're going to have to pick up Greek, right? To which I responded, well, I would love to be able to read Sophocles and Plato and Thucydides in the original Greek. I genuinely love the classics, but I don't have any money. I've got to make a living sooner or later. So if I do what you're suggesting, what am I going to do for a living? And Professor Gelly said to me, well, I'd be less than honest if I didn't say to you that you'll probably end up competing for a shrinking number of jobs teaching classics in public schools. And I said, well, if that's all you can offer, I can't justify the investment, right? Because there are other things I can do. And so I went a different way. I did a major in history, and then I did the doctorate in international relations, having, as we previously discussed, attempted to get to the US to do my graduate studies and been thwarted by lack of money. But I've always retained an interest in the classics. I've continued to read the classics, but not in Greek or Latin because I don't have the language. I have a smattering of Latin from high school, but no Greek. In fact, it was said of Shakespeare that he had small Latin and less Greek. And so I write poetry. But to come back, however, to the question of after the doctorate, when I needed a job, what did I do? And again, as I explained in the first interview, I decided, well, a coherent strategy, I think, is while the doctorate's under examination, I'll apply to the Department of Defence, which I was pretty confident I would get into. And if the doctorate was acclaimed and I got the offer of a good postdoc, I might head off to the US and chance my arm at long last in the big league. Or I might decide to stay in defence and perhaps move into defence intelligence because that was an area that interested me. Or I might make the move across to DFAT with a doctorate behind me and become a diplomat. Those were the three things I considered at that juncture.
Okay, so choosing to study history and international relations, that was kind of a practical choice of seeing like I could have a career in diplomacy and that would be better than being a high school teacher.
It was, yes, I certainly thought that would open wider horizons than being a high school teacher, although if there had been a path to Cambridge to do a DPhil in classics, if it had looked viable from the end of second year, to study ancient Greek and get to Cambridge, I might have been sorely tempted, and I've always said, if I'd been Professor Gelly at that point, if I'd been George Gelly, or more precisely, if I'd been in his position, I wouldn't have said to a bright student what he said to me. I would have said to him, young man, if you pick up ancient Greek and you keep doing as well as you've been doing, we think you'll get to Cambridge. And if you do a DPhil at Cambridge in classics and you've got your ancient Greek, and if you pick up another modern language, French or German, let's say, and the world will be your oyster. You get that doctorate from Cambridge and you'll be able to become a diplomat, a creative writer, a senior journalist, a merchant banker, who knows, the world's going to be at your feet. Don't worry about what you're going to do for a living. You won't have a problem, right? Why didn't George say that? Because he'd never been in any of those worlds. He'd only ever been an academic. And he was an Australian academic in a small pond. And all he could see were those shrinking possibilities, right? So he didn't sell me short, he was being honest with me. But he had a very limited horizon. And I wanted a wide horizon. And by doing what I did, despite the frustration of not getting to the US, I did indeed broaden my horizons. And then I discovered that, nevertheless, I really needed a job. The years were passing all too swiftly, and the only options I saw ahead of me were jobs in the federal government. And partly that was because the doctorate at ANU had been dissertation only, no coursework, so I hadn't been able to pick up any units at all in law or economics. And that would turn out to have consequences, because when people look at a CV, they look for various ticks. So if I'd had some law or economics behind me, there's a better chance that I would have been able to get that job in Hong Kong with Bill Overholt, who was going to pay me $700,000 a year, where in Canberra I was on $50,000 a year, Australian. You know, it would have totally transformed my life. But it was, pardon me, that was blocked as well. But to retreat, therefore, so I did the doctorate and I needed a job, and I thought the federal government looks like the path of least resistance, where I can get a job and stabilise my circumstances. So I applied to the Department of Defence.
So looking back, how do you deal with those frustrations? Do you just kind of accept it as it is and keep looking forward?
Oh, now I barely look back at all that sort of ancient history in my personal life now. And as I'm pretty sure I said in the first interview we did, that era in my life came to a halt really when in the mid-90s I had overcome, I thought, the obstacles in my path. I'd become head of the China Desk of Defence Intelligence. I was highly regarded, I thought, and I believed that it had to be possible for me to build a robust career as one of Australia's leading China specialists. But I was blocked again. But I think it might be useful to back up a little here and just talk about the difficulties put in my path when I applied to work in the Department of Defence and applied to work in Defence Intelligence, because there's a whole story there about personal frustration and resilience on the one hand and institutions on the other, which I think is well worth sharing.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So this is when you wanted to then move overseas. You kind of were heading the China desk in Australia.
No, to go back before I got that job.
Okay.
And we'll get back then to that as a point of departure. So when I was finishing my PhD in 1988, I was tutoring at Melbourne University in Australian politics to earn a crust. And I applied to the Department of Defence, and I was interviewed by three perfectly sensible, mature age bureaucrats, and within about 24 hours they offered me a job, and I was happy to accept because it meant I had a job for 89. But they said, of course you'll need to do a security vetting interview, and I trust that won't be a problem. I said, no, I've done nothing but study and exercise for years, I don't have any skeletons in the closet. And they said, that's good. So I anticipated that the security vetting interview, and I should add for your listeners that a security interview at that level is for what's called negative vetting. It's a basic level security clearance, right? It's not to work in intelligence, it's just work for the government. And you're only, as a rule, denied a negative vetting clearance if you've got a very serious problem like a drug addiction or just say a sexual habit that's dubious or for which you could be blackmailed, or a criminal record or whatever. And since I plainly had none of these problems, I anticipated I'd sail straight through. And I was brought up short because, first of all, I turned up for this interview which was in the Defence Building at St Kilda Road, and I anticipated in advance that there would, as with the recruitment interview, be a panel of maybe 3 people, that at least one of them might be from ASIO, and that I'd ask a lot more personal questions, but it'd be straightforward. I'd just answer the questions and sail on through. My first surprise was when I turned up and there's not 3 people, there's only one, and it's a young woman, and it quickly became apparent that although she was asking questions from a script, she really had no idea what she was talking about, and if I didn't say yes, no, she got lost very quickly, and she had some rather cranky opinions of her own, which she freely projected, and so after a while I thought, this is really strange, but I assume she's just a clerk. She's just recording my answers, and the adults in the room will make a decision and get the clearance.
What kind of opinions?
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. One is, she asked at one point, do you think that in the light of the rising crime rate in Australia and growing abuse of drugs, that Australians should be subjected to greater discipline? And I said, well, we'd need to discuss what we meant by discipline there, I think, and the anticipated effect would have on the problem in hand. And she blurted out, well, I think that people who traffic in drugs should be put to death, just like people who commit murder. And I said, that's very interesting, but you're asking for my opinion. At another point, the question was, if you were sitting in a bar and a man came up and sexually propositioned you, how would you respond? And I said, I think I'd say to him, wait a minute, you're sexually interested in me? But I said, surely the issue with being propositioned by anybody is not who it is, but how they behave when you say no thank you. And I thought, where's that question coming from? But the single most significant question, I thought, and it ought to have been when you consider the nature of clearance at issue, was can you think of any circumstances in which the leaking of government documents would be justified? And my answer was, well, look, we both know that government documents get leaked by all sorts of people, from disgruntled fine clerks to ministers. So for me to sit here and say, oh gosh, no, it would just be daffy. I said, right, I can certainly think of circumstances, right? The pointed question is, what would I personally be inclined to do, right? And in my doctorate, which I've just finished, I discuss at considerable length the case of Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, and I defend what Ellsberg did. Now, in any serious vetting process, that ought to have been, if not a showstopper, a cause for further conversation, shall we say. When I was denied a negative vetting clearance, I immediately assumed that it was in all probability because of that remark. I was in error.
About the Pentagon Papers. What's the story with that, briefly?
So the Pentagon Papers were a bunch of tens of thousands of pages of documents which Daniel Ellsberg, who had been a Pentagon analyst and a Rand Corporation analyst in the 50s and 60s, had leaked to the New York Times in 1971 in the belief that the US public was owed an accounting of how the Vietnam War had come about and why it had become such a quagmire. It was a big thing back in the day, right? But there's been polarised opinion about it ever since, right? There are still perfectly serious people who think Ellsberg had no right to do that. He really shouldn't have done it. But the courts upheld his action and the freedom of the New York Times to publish the documents, right? And in retrospect, a great many people think, as frankly so do I, that he did a principled thing, not a reckless thing. It was ultimately a constructive thing, and it contributed to the US deciding we've got to get out of this war, which they eventually did. Right? Now, but nevertheless, I could perfectly understand, and I said this in that first interview, that might well be a matter of concern to vetting authorities, and I was perfectly happy to discuss what I'd written in the doctrine. Then, of course, I'm denied a negative vetting clearance. The recruitment people rang me and said, we've got some rather bad news. You've been refused a clearance. Have you got any idea why? And my immediate reaction was, no, I couldn't think of a reason why. And the woman at the other end said, you're not a communist, are you? And I said, no, not at all. I said, anybody read my doctorate could not remotely reach the conclusion I was a communist. Oh, she said, well, we hope you won't walk away because we really want you, and security won't tell us why they refused your clearance, but we're going into bat for you. So I said, that's all right, I'm not rushing off anywhere. So what in fact occurred was that over the following 3 weeks, the recruitment people went in and said to security, you cannot deny this guy a clearance, he's our prize recruit, we really want him. So if you're going to reject him, you better give us a damn good reason. So which security responded, we don't have to give you an explanation, it's our job, so butt out. Recruitment in turn said, we're not going to butt out. You either give us a really good explanation or we go over your head to the Secretary of Defence, you choose. At which point the vetting authorities said, well, we won't explain to you because we're not obliged to do that, but we'll give them a second interview. So I then get a call from a more senior fellow in the security vetting agency who says to me, I'd like to come down to Melbourne and talk to you, can you suggest a place where we could meet? And I said, well, the first interview was in the Defence Building, St Kilda Road, one up there. He said, no, I'd like to meet privately, suggesting this was off the record or something. I was just trying to correct course. So I said, well, look, I'm living in a little flat in St Kilda, why don't you just come here? And so he did, and we spoke for 7 hours. This is for a basic security pass, right?
About what?
Well, all sorts of questions, right? The ins and outs of where I'd been, what I'd studied, what I thought, what I'd read, what I believed.
Did you enjoy it?
Oh, I found it, we were talking earlier about the nature of games. It was a kind of game. I thought this is I'd never done this before. I'd read about it being done to others, interrogations, interviews, security processes, polygraph tests, It was sort of happening to me. And
was he taking notes?
oh, yeah.
Like pen and paper as you spoke?
Yeah, there wasn't any electronic recording. But the curious thing is, after 7 hours, he paused and he said, we've been at this a while, I'm done now, have you got any questions for me? And I said, well, only one, why didn't I get clearance? And he says a little portentously, well, what do you think? And I said, well, look, I've been racking my brains for 3 weeks. I can only come up with 2 remotely plausible explanations. The first is that during my doctorate, I spent a lot of time in field work, and that included about 12 months altogether in the Philippines. Do you think I networked with the New People's Army or something or other? And he said, no. And I said, good, they wouldn't even talk to me. They regarded me as too conservative. The other is that at one point in the first interview, I was asked, could I think of any circumstances in which the leaked and governed documents would be justified? And part of my response was that in my doctorate, I discussed the case of Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, and I defend what Ellsberg did. Was it that? He said, no. I said, well, I'm stuck. What was it? He said, your interest in Russia. I said, my interest in Russia? I've just done a PhD on revolution, counter-revolution in the Cold War, and you think it's odd that I'm interested in Russia? Pardon me? I said, and the Cold War entirely apart, Russia actually is quite an interesting place. If you've ever read any Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or listened to any Tchaikovsky or Rachmaninoff, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I have no interest in Russia. It would be absurd. And at that point, he said, would you give her a meal? I said, yeah, sure. We've been at this.
I was about to ask whether you'd eaten during the 7 hours.
I'd supplied a bit of snack food in the course of the day, but at this point we went for a proper meal. We went to a Chinese restaurant nearby. And as we went there, he said to me quite equably, you're not the person I expected to meet when I came down here. And I said, oh, please explain. He said, when I read that first report on you, I formed this image of a long-haired, doped-up, crazy-eyed radical. But as soon as you opened your door, I thought, this is not the person I expected to meet. I said, well, how very interesting, At any rate, he gave me the clearance. So, it was more or less a month since the first interview, but I'd got the clearance. I was heading up to Canberra. And, but here the next, sort of curious development set in, because the very fact that I was a month late getting there compared with the other graduate recruits had led to all sorts of rumours as to why I was delayed in getting there. And the answer in everybody's mind was I had a problem getting a security clearance, which was true, just so happened that the reason was an absurdity.
So they thought you were a communist,
well, they
obsessed
didn't know,
with Russia, trying to...
No, they didn't necessarily think that, but there were rumours because nobody knew. They weren't being told.
But I mean the guy doing the security clearance.
Oh, well, that's what he'd said had been the reason. What occurred in due course is I got access to the report that she had written after the first interview. And I realised that had clearly been her interpretation, that I was pro-Soviet, pro-communist, pro-terrorist, that I was defensive, evasive, couldn't look her in her eye. It was bizarre what she'd written.
How did you get access to the report?
Well, it was because it was a negative vetting report, and therefore I was the only person who'd been interviewed. I was entitled to see it. But the reason that I got access was not because I chased it off my own bat. It was because one of the things that happened in the second interview was that I'd been asked 7 questions about my relationship with Paul Dibb. So Dibb he's an emeritus professor now, he's about 80, but he was a big wheel in defence from the 1980s onwards. He'd been head of assessments in the Joint Intelligence Organisation, which would later become the Defence Intelligence Organisation. He'd then been the person who did for Kim Beazley a systematic defence review of a kind similar to what's being done right now by Stephen Smith and Angus Houston. That had really made his career. He then went back and became Deputy Director of Joint Intelligence, then Director General of Joint Intelligence, then Deputy Secretary of Defence for Strategy and Intelligence. So he was a very prominent figure in defence circles, and I had made his acquaintance while I was still doing the doctorate, and he had said to me that I might like to consider working in intelligence, when I'd finished the PhD. And that was one of the things that had got me interested in going down that path. Now, it turned out that the security vetting people had believed for some time that Dibb himself was a Soviet agent.
Really?
Yes, they didn't tell me that, of course, but that's why they asked me all these questions. And when I did get the clearance, Dibb rang me up. He's then Deputy Secretary of Defence, right? And he rings me up in my little office and says, I believe they asked you some questions about me. I said, they did indeed. They asked me 7 questions. He said, what were the questions? And I said, well, I could go from memory, but I'll go you one better. I'll go and get access to the file. I'll give you a verbatim account, right? So I got access to the file, and in the process, I not only got the questions that asked me about him or my relationship with him, but I saw what had been written about me in the first place, and it was eye-poppingly crazy.
And you didn't know at that point that they thought he was a spy?
I hadn't known in advance that they thought he was a spy, but a couple of other people had said to me prior to that they thought he was, right?
So then didn't you have hesitation sharing with him the security questions? Or you thought it was... You didn't think he was a spy?
I didn't have any hard evidence either way, and I was then, as I am even more now, deeply conversant with the question of who and who was not a Soviet spy and the way accusations are thrown around and the slippery nature of the evidence. So I was able to hold the tension between those two. But all he'd asked me were what were the questions. There was no question of giving him information to which he wasn't entitled. He was Deputy Secretary of Defence, so I just said to him, all right, these are the questions I was asked, right?
And what did he do with that?
I have no idea. What I discovered many years later, and this is jumping ahead a bit in the story, but I had a long dinner with Dibb in Canberra a year or two ago, and one of the things we talked about was what had happened way back in 1989-90. And he said that as a result of the way I had been treated by security vetting, and this was complete news to me, he and the Secretary of Defence, a man called Tony Ayres, had abolished the Office of Special Clearances and Records, which had been responsible for vetting, and rebooted the whole question of how security vetting is done. That was something to learn after many years.
And so this guy isn't a spy?
Well, he's retired now, so whether he was, I don't know. That's a whole other issue of great complexity, and it's one of a number of cases, both here and overseas, that I'm conversant with, which remain, shall we say, indeterminate. That could be a subject for a whole conversation on its own. I've done quite a bit of work on a number of quite famous international cases where the merits of the argument have been disputed literally for decades, right? And James Angleton, who used to be head of counterintelligence in the CIA in the 50s and 60s, once famously remarked that counterintelligence is a wilderness of mirrors, right? That it's very difficult and it's intended to be very difficult, by those who set up spies and penetration agents to get the facts right. If somebody's a a double agent or even a triple agent? How do you tell? Well, the nature of the tradecraft is that you're not supposed to be able to tell, because if it's easy to tell, it doesn't work, right? But as I say, that's digressing from the question of my own personal trajectory, because the thing is, I got the negative vetting clearance. I arrive in Canberra, I discover rumours have been spreading around me that I had difficulty getting a clearance for all sorts of, speculative reasons people didn't know. But once I was up there, then I thought what I would like to do is to work in intelligence. And the first impediment I discover is that largely because not only had I been denied the clearance in the first place on bogus grounds, but the judgment had been that I was pro-Soviet and pro-communist, impediments were put in my path to even getting into the intelligence world. I had to get a positive vetting clearance for that. And the positive vetting clearance was far more protracted than the negative vetting one. It took more than 12 months to get that clearance.
Wow. And what appealed to you about intelligence?
Well, I'd done my PhD essentially on the capacity the US government had exhibited throughout the Cold War to understand the nature of a communist challenge and the nature of communist-led insurgencies in the developing world, and how it had thought through what do you do about that? How do you do counterinsurgency that works? Right? So that had a lot to do with intelligence, counterintelligence, the work of field analysts and spies and so on. And so I'd learned a lot about what went wrong in the Cold War and what didn't. And I thought, I'm equipped therefore to be a good intelligence analyst, and it would be very interesting to work inside the system, which is of course a provincial adjunct of the US system in a lot of ways. We're part of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. And I thought it'd be interesting to see, do we exhibit the same problems as the US system at the higher level? What I hadn't anticipated is that I would have difficulty getting security clearances, and the positive vetting, as I say, was a protracted process, which we could discuss. Needless to say, I got it, but again, in order to get it, I had to basically go through channels to appeal to the Secretary of Defence, who overruled the security vetting people to ensure they got my clearance. I then discovered that there'd nevertheless been a ruling by somebody, I don't know to this day who it was, but I was never to be permitted to work on the United States as long as I worked for the Australian government.
And you don't know why that is?
I can only assume it's because I was deemed in my doctoral work to have been too critical of the CIA and counterinsurgency operations in Vietnam, El Salvador and the Philippines.
And what were your criticisms based on?
Oh, on all sorts of areas that had occurred over time, on misjudgments of political situations, on violence that had been used. I mean, I had dug very deep to discover what exactly had been the links between the CIA and the death squads in El Salvador, and the truth is not pretty. And this had come up during the positive vetting, because I was asked point blank by the vetting officer, if you were given positive vetting clearance and you worked in defence intelligence and you discovered classified documents which showed that the Reagan administration in the 1980s did know who was running the death squads in Central America, what would you do? And I said, first of all, as it happens, I pretty much know the truth about that matter, right? It's in my doctorate. Secondly, my understanding of the role of a scholar is to be an absolute ferret in digging up the truth, and that's what I've done. And you publish because that's what you do as a scholar. My understanding of the role of an intelligence analyst is to do every bit as much of a ferret in digging up the truth, but instead of publishing, you report to the government, right? And so this was what I would do.
And what was the truth?
The truth was that the CIA had been closely linked to death squads in El Salvador since the 1950s.
And what did the death squads do?
They killed thousands of people in order to prevent a communist revolution.
Huh. And were you ever fearful when you were investigating these things?
No, fearful would be the wrong word. I mean, I did field work in Mexico and El Salvador, and that is distinctly more dangerous than being in a study in Australia. But I never felt that I was in immediate danger. When I was in San Salvador, this is way back in 1984, right, doing field work, I stayed at the Hilton, the hotel in the heart of San Salvador, and I knew that a freelance American journalist, a young guy, had booked into the Hilton on a visit to El Salvador and then disappeared. I knew that these things could happen. I knew that 2 US land reform advisors and the head of the land reform agency 3 years before I was there had been shot dead by a right-wing hit squad in the coffee lounge of that hotel. And the bullet marks were still on the walls.
Wait, sorry, who had killed who in that situation?
Right-wing hit squads had come into the coffee lounge in the San Salvador Sheraton where I was staying and shot dead 2 US land reform advisors and the head of the Salvadoran land reform agency.
And why did they do that?
Because they were opposed to land reform. They represented the landowning elite in El Salvador, which the US and particularly the CIA were backing.
And why? What is land reform, and why was the US backing it?
Well, so here we get into Salvadoran history. This is the thing. You see, we have a conversation about my life. You go down all sorts of, I don't know. I mean, one does go down all sorts of rabbit holes because I've been involved in so many things. The history of El Salvador is, in important respects, the history of coffee. So El Salvador, as part of the American Isthmus, was conquered by the Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century, and like much of the rest of South America, it was just exploited ruthlessly by its conquerors, and the native population became peons on haciendas, and their culture, their agriculture went to waste. In the 19th century, it was discovered, first of all in Brazil, that coffee was a going thing, a commodity, and the Salvadoran elite decided, here's where we can make more money than we've been making out of exporting cattle or other stuff to Europe. So they started growing coffee, and in order to expand their coffee production as the market grew, they expropriated more and more land from the remaining communal land in native hands. And it got to the point by the 1920s where coffee constituted 95% of the exports of El Salvador. And then the Great Depression occurred, the October crash 1929. Coffee prices plummeted. It threw their whole economy into a tailspin. Thousands of people lost their jobs, their incomes. There was a peasant uprising, and the army crushed that uprising, executing about 30,000 peasants in the process. From that point, El Salvadoran politics were dominated by a military which was determined to keep the peasants in their place, and a quasi-liberal elite that were interested in profits and property and order, but not necessarily in fascism, and they had a tussle between them. When I was investigating it, it was because in 1979 there'd been a coup by a group of officers who said the country needs to be put to rights again, and there were tensions over how to handle the situation. The US under Jimmy Carter said, well, what's needed for this country to go forward is a combination of land reform to give more of a stake in the economy to ordinary peasants as distinct from the landowning elite. It needs political reform in order to democratise the country further, and it needs human rights to be recognised and enforced. In 1984, while I was on my way to El Salvador via the US West Coast of Mexico, I was reading a book by a US journalist from the New York Times, Raymond Bonner, who'd spent a couple of years in El Salvador, and a book called Weakness and Deceit, US Policy in El Salvador. And it was fascinating to me that he'd interviewed Robert White, who'd been Carter's ambassador to El Salvador. And White had said to him, when I arrived in the country with a brief from Carter to do whatever it took to avert a Castro-style revolution in El Salvador, something short of that, but he said, I was going around talking up the need for land reform, political reform, human rights. What I discovered was that the CIA station chief was saying to the hardline colonels, that's all I watch, we support you guys. So there was a cleft in US policy, and when Ronald Reagan came to power...
Wait, the US was saying we support who?
Not the US in its official spokesman capacity, but you had Jimmy Carter was the president. He appointed Robert White ambassador, saying you back reform in El Salvador. So Robert White goes down there
because they're trying to stop. They're trying to spread the values of freedom and Western values.
Well, broadly
and
speaking,
stop communism.
Yeah, stop communism at the same time. So they didn't want a Castro-style revolution in El Salvador, all right? But that didn't mean that fascism and brutal repression were acceptable. He was sent down there, White, and he was known prior to that as a champion of human rights in the Southern Cone, right? So he's talking up these things, but then he says to Bonner, but I learned that the CIA station chief, who'd been there ahead of him, was saying to the hardline colonels behind closed doors, not publicly, that's all I watch, we support you guys. So there was a division within US policy, right? Now this is completely consistent with what I discovered in case after case. US policy was not univocal, right, in this regard, not only in Central America, but in Southeast Asia, and the Philippines, and Vietnam. That was the gist of my doctoral inquiry. And I eventually found Robert White myself, right, and interviewed him. And he reiterated what he'd said to Bonner. Conversely, when I arrived in El Salvador, I met the public relations officer at the US Embassy. He, when I asked him, did you read Raymond Bonner's book about El Salvador? And he said to me, don't talk to me about Raymond Bonner. He's an advocate journalist. His book should be subtitled A Misleading and Tendentious Account of US Policy in El Salvador. And I said, so you've read his book? He said, no, I haven't. I don't want to put money in his pocket. And I said, well, do you think anybody in the State Department or the agency is likely to read his book and write a sustained critique of it to show where it's misleading and tendentious? And he said, no, I don't think so. This was what I was dealing with, right? And so to come back to your question that triggered those remarks about El Salvador, I had written this up in my doctorate, and conservative people in the security vetting agencies regarded me, therefore, as too critical of the CIA, and they didn't want me poking around in that territory. So I was begrudgingly given my clearance at the orders of the Secretary of Defense, but I wasn't told this, but I subsequently learned the ruling had been he's not to work on the United States. So I was put to work on East Asia.
So that was my question about being fearful. Were you fearful of the US, is what I meant, rather than being killed by someone while you were travelling? Were you worried about if I expose this truth?
Yeah. No, I've never been. I mean, the US is a very complex country, and people often have grossly oversimplified views of it. It's a huge place. I remember not being interviewed. I was interviewing a former CIA analyst in the Philippines back in the 80s, still part of the doctorate, a woman called Marjorie Ravenholt. And like a number of such people I interviewed at that time, she was initially very guarded in her remarks. It was quite clear that she thought this guy's a university student, so he's probably left-wing. But after about 20 minutes, she discernibly relaxed, and she said to me, you don't sound anti-American. And I said, well, Marjorie, there's 250 million Americans. There's some of them I don't like. There's a great many I've never met. I mean, the United States, has a history of visionary political institutions and ideals, but also, make no bones about it, of both colonial violence, of slavery, of civil war, of deeply contentious politics, of a higher crime rate and homicide rate than any other country in the Western world. This is the United States. And its foreign policy in the Cold War was a combination of liberal internationalism, Wilsonian internationalism, and frankly, right-wing opportunism, of a capitalist desire to be the number one power and get into markets and make a lot of money. And many people did. Right, and I was fully aware of all that, right?
But couldn't it be a positive thing, like the idea of liberalism, if we spread, these ideas and then we all trade and everyone benefits because these people are free, living in democracies, and they're getting richer and we're getting richer?
Sure, that was the theory of liberal internationalism, right? And it still is. But liberal internationalism is not and never has been the single, unitary and presiding creed of the United States, all right? That's one reason there was a civil war, right? The Yankees in the North eventually decided, well, we can't allow slavery to spread. But the Southerners had another idea altogether, and they would not cut a deal about it. And you ended up with a very bloody civil war, right?
And I guess there's because liberal values would be people can live freely under whatever religion and whatever they can do whatever they want in their country, but we will trade with them. But then there's the American idea of, no, we have to spread our way of doing things, and other religions or other ways of doing things need to be changed.
Yeah, partly that. Woodrow Wilson himself, famously back in the 1910s, espoused this idea that we need, in the wake of the First World War and then the Russian Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, such as it then was, 1912, we need to make the world safe for democracy, right? And what exactly did that entail? Well, in the First World War, it entailed sending American troops to Europe to defeat the Kaiser, right? After the First World War, his view was that we needed the League of Nations and we needed the US to be engaged internationally to prevent, what he called irrational revolutions and fascism and so on from breaking out. But the US Congress had other ideas, and the US did not join the League of Nations. And the League of Nations failed in its bid to prevent war, and we got the Second World War. The US got drawn into the Second World War, and at the end of the Second World War, Roosevelt and then Truman said, well, we've got to avoid the mistakes we made after the First World War. So we got actively engaged in building international institutions that might indeed make it possible for a more peaceful and open world to arise. And in important respects, it's been an outstanding success. But along the way, there have been a lot of bumps, right? And the struggle with the Soviet Union and communist insurgencies has been a big part of that, which is why I made it my doctoral subject.
Okay, so you kind of just went about it like you're searching for truth, and you didn't... Like, how did you get people to agree to speak to you? You just said, I'm researching this, could we please talk?
Yeah. And US officials overwhelmingly agreed to meet, whereas the communists in the Philippines refused to talk to me, right?
Why do you think that was?
Because as one of them who had spent time in Australia and who officially was not a communist, but I knew he was. He was a party member, but he knew me from I knew he'd been in Australia, and he said that the reality is you're a right winger, you're a conservative. Why would we talk to you? And I said, in the interests of truth and inquiry, if you've got a just cause, persuade me. They didn't want to do that. They were engaged in violent revolution, and communist insurgency and communist revolution have always, in the Leninist spirit, been about an underground movement and so-called United Front activities that make opportunistic alliances that lie blatantly about their goals, right? To mislead people, to make it possible to minimise resistance until they take over.
And that's purely just they want power.
Yeah.
A small group of people want power.
They want power to the end that they can transform society according to their lights, right? But they will allow nothing to get in their way, which is why when they seize power, you get terror, right? And it's always happened. If you take, just digressing a little bit, we've been talking about Central America. When Castro takes power in Cuba in 1959, one of the things he does pretty much immediately is there's hundreds of the police and the army officers and senior officials that work for the Batista administration rounded up and executed. Why? Because they are the people, in his considered judgment, and not unreasonably, who would stage a counter-revolution if allowed liberty. So he simply has them killed.
And do you think he genuinely believes communism, or leaders like Castro genuinely believe that communism is the greatest good for all, and they're genuinely doing a good thing, and that's just part of the price they have? Okay, we have to execute some people, but overall everyone's going to be better off? Or is it, I guess leader by leader it's different, but how much of it is just I want power and I'm going to trick everyone that this is the right way?
Well, there have been very long-running questions in that regard about most of the communist dictators, including Lenin and Stalin and Mao and so on. And what seems to me a liberal or constitutionalist person would say in light of that history is that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether they're sincere or whether they're lying. What matters is that if you allow a system to arise that can operate the way communist totalitarianism does, it's going to be very bloody and costly. It's going to be very oppressive. That's the way they run societies. It always has been. There have been no exceptions. And the worst cases, like Cambodia under Pol Pot, are just appalling, right? And it's possible to make a case that, to use that example, that Pol Pot and the people around him genuinely believed that Cambodia would be better off if it reverted to an agrarian paradise, and that what they needed to do was empty the cities, as they did, to eliminate the intellectuals who'd been educated overseas, albeit so had they, right?
Me and you both sitting here with glasses on.
Indeed, right. So, one can argue back and forth whether Pol Pot was sincere, but from the point of view of what he did, it's almost worse if he was sincere, right? To be sincere and then do what he did just is the most appalling thing. There's been a long argument about whether Stalin was just some gangster, complete opportunist who went for power and didn't care about anything else, or whether he was a convinced Leninist who did what he did precisely because he thought that was called for by the theory, right? And there's very sound scholarship suggesting that, shocking though his actions were, that he was highly intelligent and he was doing what he did because he thought that's what was called for by the revolution. In which case, it seems to me, we should be saying, we'll never allow such revolutions. And that was, in fact, the attitude of many people in the CIA and the US State Department during the Cold War, that they believed, and I would say correctly, that Stalinism and Maoism were horrendous things. They weren't liberating, they weren't emancipating, they were not a promising future for humanity. Did that mean that some other utopia could readily be found or created around the world? No. Did it mean that we needed to resist communist revolution? Yes. How do we do that? Well, we have to invent whatever means come to hand, and we don't even agree about what the best methods are. So debates continued, and I wanted to understand those debates and how they went. That's why I did the doctorate.
But isn't that the key point, that we can debate and speak openly, and we don't just say this is truth, execute anyone who disagrees? Like, that's the dangerous bit. So yes. As long as we're still speaking and allowing different views, then we'll always stay on the right path.
I don't know the right path, but if we're on a path where we're freely debating, where overall we're learning, then we're doing probably about as well as we reasonably can. And that's it. And if you look back over the long haul, a reasonable case can be made that humanity has made a lot of progress in various ways. Does that mean that we've got to a perfect place? Hell no. Does it mean there is a perfect place? No. But there's better or worse. And whenever people become critical about Australia, about its real or alleged deficiencies, I say, well, okay, who's going to argue that Australia's perfect? But you can join organisations that want to make a constructive change. You can change your own opinions. You can read what you choose. You can speak publicly, and for the most part not be, imprisoned or censored for doing it. You can vote governments in and out of office. It's just pretty much as good as it gets. So if you ask me, would I prefer to live in Australia or in Xi's China or Putin's Russia or the Iran of the theocrats or Erdogan's Turkey, it's laid out as there. There's no conceivable way I'd go to live in any of those other places and the rules that work there.
And so what would you say to people who say, well, China has lifted, like, look at the development, they've lifted all these people out of poverty and life's getting better? Well, maybe not recently, but generally it was like life was just getting better and better. So, and they've done that under communism.
Yeah, so what I'd say to that is the Communist Party has not lifted hundreds of millions of people in China out of poverty. Hundreds of millions of people in China lifted themselves out of poverty, just to the extent that the Communist Party got the hell out of their way and stopped dominating them economically. And it's only gone part way down that path, and Xi Jinping is pulling back in the other direction as hard as he can. So if you go back to the beginning of the reform and opening, essentially what Deng and the people around him said to themselves and then more or less to the country is, what Mao did was a disaster economically. It kept the country poor and oppressed and at times completely chaotic. Tens of millions of people died of starvation because of his misconceived policies. The Cultural Revolution wrecked the place. We're changing. We have looked at what's happened in the rest of East Asia, and those countries have prospered in ways we've never done under Mao. We want to prosper that way. How are we going to do it? We need to import capital and technology. We need food production to increase. So one of the first steps they undertook was to allow peasants who had been on communes that had kept everybody poor and had been required to grow grain that was simply taken by the state and redistributed according to its lights. And they said to the peasants, provided you deliver a set quota of grain in your free time on your own plots, you can produce cash crops. Right? Given that freedom, the peasants started to produce chickens and pigs and peanuts and fruit and all sorts of things, cash crops on the market. The food supply in China trebled within a couple of years. Was that the Communist Party lifting them out of power? No, it was getting the fuck out of the way, pardon the expression. Right? That's what happened in China. The driver of all that growth in China for the last 40 years was the private sector, not the state sector. What happened in the state sector was state-owned enterprises kept getting subsidised by the government, which run the banks, right? And the banks are the only place where ordinary Chinese can put their money unless they stuff it under the mattress. And then it's used by the state not to provide capital to private enterprises, which often found it hard to get loans, but to subsidise state-owned enterprises, all right? So the Communist Party didn't lift people out of poverty. The other thing to bear in mind is that that growth was possible not only because people were finally enabled to take initiatives and go to market, but because China did this in a context of an East Asia and a global economy that under the Pax Americana had grown enormously and which was very happy to invest in China, to very happy to open its market to China's low-end exports as they began, right? And very happy to engage in two-way tourism and so on. So the opportunities for China as a latecomer to a maturing market system were enormous. And finally, you had a Chinese diaspora, tens of millions of people who had left China decades ago to get away from imperial Chinese autocracy or had fled the communists, right? They had made good in the outside world. And they had family members who got in touch with them and said, China's opening for business again. And from them came a lot of investment, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, from the United States, from Canada. That lifted people out of poverty. To hell with the Communist Party.
So that's Chinese propaganda, basically, that makes people think. Because when I was at Cambridge, everyone's talking about China and whatever. And I thought, everyone's talking about this, but no one's asking. Like, my course was 40% Chinese. Like, no one's asking the people next to us what they think about the CCP. And obviously, okay, for them to be at Cambridge, or a friend from Hong Kong was explaining, for these people to be at Cambridge, they are part of an elite part of China and benefiting from the CCP. But probably children or grandchildren of party members in many cases. Yeah. Well, someone arrived on a private jet, and I thought, how is that possible? Anyway, but I kind of asked them, okay, everyone's saying, China, how terrible, like you don't get to watch, Hollywood movies or whatever. And the answer was kind of, and from, the Chinese friends themselves, as well as other kind of American Chinese, said that this is what they would say, that we don't care about getting on Facebook, whatever, you can get a VPN to do that. We don't really care. We care that the government has helped lift us out of poverty, and our parents didn't have food and now we do have food. So it was like they were attributing that to the government. But doesn't it strike you as strange that they would say, we have food and our parents didn't? Why did their parents not have food? Because the Communist Party ruled China and Maoism was in place, and it keeps people poor, right? And why did more food appear on tables? Not because the Communist Party produced it, because the peasants did, because they were told they could go to market and do it. When they set up, Shenzhen and other little special economic zones in the early 80s, what was it that these zones were there to do? They were there under special, more or less market-based rules instead of communist command economy rules, but as enclaves so the party could feel that it still got control, right? And in those enclaves, people were able to operate much as they had in Hong Kong. And surprise, surprise, capitalism flourished. And the party was so astonished at this growth that an internal debate then took place inside the party in the 1980s. Should we be going down a capitalist road? Mao was shooting people for doing that. He purged Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi in the 1960s for being, as he called them, capitalist roaders, right? Deng had famously made the statement, it doesn't matter whether a cat is grey or black as long as it catches mice, right? And in 1992, he did his famous southern tour. He visited Shenzhen and these places which were booming, and he said, let's just enrich ourselves.
right? In other words, let's do more of this. And then he started to open up more of the country, right? And the more of it that opened up, the more foreign capital could come in, the more people could take initiatives and form companies and trade and travel, the more country grew. That was the Communist Party getting out of the way. It wasn't the Communist Party running the economy.
So I guess that's my question. Do you think it's propaganda? Because, you know, they're not allowed to talk about Tiananmen Square anymore. Like, it's possible they don't know the history. So for all they know, they've been told it's the government who's doing this, and then they genuinely believe that.
They either genuinely believe it or they don't know what else to believe because they have no other information. It's very hard to get hold of. And if you're growing up in a party family, it's to draw a rough analogy, it's probably like growing up in an really old-fashioned Catholic family, where you're told the church is the ground and pillar of truth. Jesus really came to save us. He's the Son of God. He rose from the dead. The Virgin Mary is his mother, and she had a virgin birth, and so on. And you grow up believing this stuff, you know, because it's all around you. You don't even stop in the old-fashioned way, and more people have in our lifetimes. But, you know, the time was when people just grew up believing this stuff because they were taught it, right? But if you step back from it and critically examine it, you think, wait a minute, do I believe any of this? Right? So when people in China have had the opportunity to read more deeply and independently into China's history, and this includes people like most recently and notably a former senior professor from the party's own Central Party School, KCR, who's now living in exile in the United States, she says the reality is that the party got a lot of things wrong and that it's like a mafia in China. It battens on the Chinese people. It's got to change. And it lies to the Chinese people. This is a senior party professor from their own Central Party School speaking in exile in the United States. And she wrote an essay, which was published in Foreign Affairs, called The Weakness of Xi Jinping. Why weakness when he makes the great show of being this strong, immovable leader? It's weakness because to clasp all power to oneself, to insist that your own thinking should be the thinking of everybody in a country, is lunacy. It's not strength. And we need to see through all of that. And many people, it seems to me, despite all the censorship and the firewall around the net, many people in China do see through it. And so we saw during the COVID lockdown periods, people finally getting frustrated and going to the streets and demonstrating and saying, not only are we fed up with this, we think Xi Jinping has to stand down and the Communist Party has to go. That's despite all the repression, the censorship, the surveillance. That's impressive. We've gone a fair way.
We've gone way off track.
We have gone way off track, but that's the way conversations will often go, right? And instead you could say, well, this is a conversation. But if we come back to where we left off, which is so, having got my security clearances, right, I get into defence intelligence, so we're back in 1990. And two things happened in short order. The first was that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Almost at the time I got my clearance and entered DIO. But I remember distinctly thinking I couldn't, from a certain point of view, be in a better place to observe how this is going to play out, because I'm going to be in an agency whose job it is to monitor these things. And Australia is part of the alliance that has declared through President Bush Senior and Thatcher, this will not stand. We're going to push him out of Kuwait. And so I was going to have a ringside seat, I thought, to watch this fight, which I did. However, at the same time, having been asked by the head of the US and Global Affairs Division in DIO would I work for him, because he knew of my doctorate, but he didn't know at that point about the whole controversy of my vetting. Would I like to work for him? I said, sure.
Would you like to work for who?
For the head of the US and Global Affairs Division, right? I said, sure. And then nothing happened. And after I'd just sort of been waiting for him to act and nothing happened, the head of the Asia section said to me, will you work for me? I said, sure. So that was why I ended up working in East Asia. It wasn't that I got in and I said, I want to work on China, and they said, okay, if that's what you want. Nobody asked me what I want, so much as that I was clearly qualified to work on the US and Global Affairs desk for sure. But what I didn't know, and the head of that section, 2 years later, when he'd left the organisation, asked me out to lunch and told me that he'd been informed I was never to be allowed to work on the United States. But the head of Asia section, whether or not he'd been told that, perhaps was encouraged to offer me a job, and he said, well, you've got a PhD, I guess you can think. I need an analyst of East Asian geopolitics. Will you work for me? I said, let's do it. So this is June, July 1990, and even though the US and its whole alliance system were cranking up and moving into Kuwait and then fighting the Iraq War, and I was as qualified as anybody in the organisation to have been an analyst of that, and even to have been sent to the Gulf to work in the intelligence division there, I was never allowed in the door on that.
And were you disappointed?
Oh no, I was throwing myself into learning about East Asia. I thought that's what they want me to do, and it so happened that in 1990, Ross Garnaut, who had been our ambassador to China in the late 80s and an economic advisor to Bob Hawke, released a report called Australian and Northeast Asian Ascendancy, which I read, and he was saying East Asia is where Australia's economic future lies. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, but above all China, which is beginning to open up. And I thought, this is where I can make a career. And so I just put the whole vetting thing behind me and thought, let's really go work on East Asia. And I worked the phone and I started reading everything I could on it. And I had a good generalist knowledge anyway, so I had a good base on which to start. And in that capacity, I was promoted almost annually, so that within 4 years I was head of the China desk. But in the meantime, I'd been head of the Japan and Korea's desk, and I'd been to Japan and Korea as a DIO analyst, and then I got to visit, once I got the China job, I got to visit China and Taiwan.
And what was the objective of the work you were doing?
Well, therein lies another story. So the nature of the work, generically, was to monitor, let's say China, right, any given country, in terms of its economics, in terms of its politics, in terms of its diplomatic relations, in terms of its military capabilities, in terms of its strategic planning, and report to Australian government officials. And this included all sorts of information. So whatever was published in books, newspapers, magazines, whatever sent to us by our intelligence officers or defence personnel, whatever is circulating through the channels of Five Eyes, that is our intelligence allies. All that, my job was to absorb, make sense of, and brief defence officials, government officials, sometimes individual political or bureaucratic leaders. And so, for example, because I'd been head of Japan and Korea's desk in 1992-93, in early 94, I was asked, well, to be precise, I think I was saying this earlier, the Secretary of Defence decided that he and the senior military officers, the so-called Chiefs of Staffs Committee, needed a briefing on North Korea's nuclear program. And General Hartley, who was the Director of Defence Intelligence, came into the analysts' weekly meeting on a Monday morning, and he said, this has to be the best briefing DIO's ever given, so I want Monk to do it. So I was asked to give that briefing, and I did. And we mentioned Paul Dibb earlier, who's by then over at ANU as the Professor of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. He rang me a week or two after I'd given that briefing. He said, that briefing did you a lot of good.
And what was the briefing about?
North Korea's nuclear weapons program.
Okay.
Right. And so that I used that as an illustration of what the job entailed.
And then do you ever get to find out what they do, the decisions they make based on the information you're delivering? Or you just kind of move on to the next thing?
Well, to some extent. I mean, the Deputy Director of Defence Intelligence, by the time I was in my last year there, was a fellow called Doug Keane, with whom I didn't really get on. I met him at a party recently, and we had a lovely conversation. We were perfectly relaxed and friendly because it was many years later, but I didn't get on with him when I was there. But he said to me one day, it's well known that you're a highly influential intelligence analyst, but for that very reason, you shouldn't be writing in the press, because I used to write book reviews and opinion pieces in the press. He said, because what would happen if you expressed an opinion about China policy and then the government did something else, what conclusion would people reach? Well, I said, well, it's hypothetical, because I don't do that. I don't write about my professional work in the press. I write about all sorts of other things. And I said, but in any case, let's hypothetically imagine that did occur. Would people perhaps not draw the conclusion that people in intelligence aren't just drones, that they have minds of their own? is that really such a bad thing? Well, in his view, it was. He said, you've got to understand you're not intellectual, you're a public servant, and you're entitled to hold and express opinions that have been cleared by the department. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I beg to differ, I am an intellectual, and I'm here because I think I have something to offer, and if I reach the conclusion that what I have to offer is not wanted, I'm not going to be staying.
But that's not even about being an intellectual, that's just about being a human and being able to form your own views.
Yes, but a lot of people don't. They conform. And I was reminded of this, and again, we're digressing a bit, but we can come back in a moment. All those years passed, I walk away from Defence Intelligence at the end of 1995 for a bunch of reasons, some of which we've discussed. And yet, in the years that have elapsed since, because of my completely independent public writing, I've become highly regarded as a China analyst, right? And in 2019, I was invited to address a whole of government forum on China in Canberra. There were about 400 people in the auditorium. And these people are all working on China for the federal government. They're all on full-time salaries to work on every aspect of China, trade and finance, internal affairs, diplomatic relations, whatever. Nobody has paid me a salary since 1995 to work on China, right? I give a talk there and I had them eating out of my hand. I got no pushback. I had nobody challenge me or say, well, I think you're wrong about this, or why would you consider that, or what about this possibility? I was looking forward to that, give and take. It didn't happen. Why? Because these people, first of all, are paid to work in a siloed basis, in a chain of reporting or command, and they do not, in any meaningful way, think for themselves. They don't have breadth of knowledge. And I, to them, was, I would say, a somewhat intimidating figure, totally independent, had a public reputation for my writing, was seen as an expert by people who don't have the breadth and confidence of their opinions, and even if they do, they're not encouraged to express independent opinions because they've got a subordinate place in a hierarchy, right? That's the way governments, and it must be said, many corporations work. And so I was, relieved that I had got out of the system, but also dismayed because I thought, you can't formulate effective policy if all you've got in the zoo are monkeys, right?
That's interesting. That reminds me of something else a Chinese friend said about the Uyghur issue, I guess in general, he said, shutting down protests and things like that. Maybe we're talking about Hong Kong. And he said, that's good that the government stops that because it's disruptive. We need social cohesion.
Yeah.
So we can't have people expressing different views. Everyone just needs to agree, have the same values so we can move forward.
Yeah, if everybody had the same values in a deep sense, there'd be no technological innovation. Nobody would be thinking divergently and saying, well, how about this possibility? What about this idea? Let's change that. Let's do this differently. That's what drives change. And in a system that's bureaucratized and driven by ideology, that gets stifled. And the big danger for China now to Xi Jinping is he's enforcing that, right? That simply cannot be good for China.
So do you think that's dangerous that's happening here, or do you think that's just kind of human nature, that it's easier for the majority of people to just follow orders or just agree or conform?
Well, there's always been a danger of, let's call it default conformism, as distinct from enforced conformism. So in China, conformity is enforced to the greatest extent the party can manage it. In Western societies, it's not generally, except by activist groups who try and impose their opinions, but who you can take or leave because they're not operating under the law, they're not the government, they're not an authority. Nevertheless, a great many people, because they lack the independence of mind, the depth of knowledge to form robust opinions of their own, will generally take the path of least resistance in terms of both knowledge and expressed belief, because it's too difficult to do otherwise, and it's always therefore been difficult in varying degrees, but difficult for individuals and innovators to chart their own course and do their own thing. And sometimes they've paid a high price for it, But over the longer haul, we cherish that, or say we do, in the West, because we can see that alone has made possible the scientific and industrial revolutions and the breakthrough to the extraordinary liberties and technologies that we enjoy in the 21st century.
So do you think we can teach that, or should we be teaching that? How to think critically, how to form your own opinion, that it's not only okay to disagree, it's good to disagree, because then you can move forward, and that's how innovation comes about.
Yes, there are niceties of phrasing. I'm not inclined to phrase it exactly that way. If you say that it's good to disagree, people get cantankerous and opinionated, and they're not thinking clearly, all right? Which is not to say they should simply conform. They need to think a bit harder before they open their traps, right? And people in general are not very well equipped to do that. And the really problematic thing is it's what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It is the less well-informed, the less mentally adroit people are, the more likely they are to be opinionated and to fail to realise that they need to think harder because they think they're perfectly clear in their thinking. All right, this is a problem, and it's convenient for most people to take the path, as I said, of least resistance. So if you've got a society, as we certainly did until very recently, where most people would profess to be Christians of some kind or other, then the easiest thing for people to do on the whole is to say, yes, I'm a Christian, without necessarily having any deep commitment, but because it's too hard to swim against the current. And it's been the free thinkers, the free spirits, the professed atheists, etc., who've spoken out and said, no, I don't believe that stuff, right? But that shocks a lot of people, not because they have deep beliefs, though some do, but because it's a challenge, right? This person's standing out from the crowd and, whoa, this is threatening, right? That is, it seems to me, an almost universal human tendency, and it makes the institutionalisation of liberty and innovation really challenging, which is why it hasn't taken root in a lot of the world, and it's a constant challenge to sustain it.
That's why I love, I don't know if I've already said this to you, my experience of Judaism and some of my Jewish friends, or maybe even the majority of my Jewish friends who are Jewish because culturally they're Jewish, and it's even encouraged, like they have these discussions with I've been along to the rabbi's house and you're having discussions about religion and what's true, and you're encouraged to come up with your own opinions, or at least, some of my friends, they're there as atheists and they are welcome at the rabbi's house to discuss these things, and they are Jewish, but they're decided, well, I don't believe in this and I'm an atheist. And that's how I try to make Catholicism. I say I'm Catholic, that's a cultural thing, that's my ancestors Italian, Irish, so therefore Catholic. But what do I think about, I'm forming my own views about spirit, or having my own experiences with spirituality, and I'm allowed to do that. And because I think it's important, it's helpful to say, okay, this is where I came from, this is the society I live in, these are the values, and then I'll explore it, be encouraged to think about it. But it's not like everyone has to start from scratch, because I think there are some good things about, okay, it's like traditions. It's like, okay, we sit down and have dinner together. Like, that's a good thing.
Yes. Have you ever seen the film Fiddler on the Roof?
I've seen that. I think I saw it on Broadway.
Right. So when you say there's tradition, right, that's more or less the way the film starts, right?
The song, I remember.
Why do we do all these things? I can tell you in one word: tradition, right? And then he sings a song, tradition. And Judaism is, I think, unusual among world religions for a couple of reasons. One is that it's only ever been the religion of a little group of people. It's never been a global religion. It's spread around the globe, but it's the Jewish religion. It's the religion of an ethnic group, which is not true of Catholicism or Islam or even Hinduism, although that's largely confined to India. And there've never been vast numbers of them, right, where there's huge numbers of Hindus and Catholics and Muslims and so on. but more importantly, because within Judaism, there's always been strenuous disagreement and debate about what does Scripture mean. Now, there's two reasons for that. One of them is that, on any reasonable reading of the Old Testament, what you see is, first of all, God can't get it right. He creates human beings and they keep letting him down, and so he gets angry with them, and he wipes them out and lets them start again. Then he sends fire and destroys cities and so on. But finally, Moses is to lead the Jewish people to freedom, to the promised land, and if they follow the law of Moses, everything's going to be terrific in his land of milk and honey, except they don't follow the law, do they? Fall away. And so bad things start to happen. And what you see throughout the Old Testament is that the prophets keep trying to explain in their own minds and to the Jewish people why it is that the great empires keep giving them a hard time. It's because they've fallen away from the law. If only they turn back and follow the law of God, everything would be just hunky-dory. But it gets harder and harder to do that, because regardless of what people do, the empires keep conquering them, because that's the way the world is, right? The Assyrians conquer them, the Babylonians conquer them, the Persians take over, the Greeks take over, the Romans take over, the Jews rebel and get crushed. How do the prophets explain this? Well, in the end, by the time you get to the book of Daniel, this is before the New Testament, the prophecy becomes apocalyptic, that in order for everything to be turned to rights, there's going to be this huge upheaval and all the empires will be flattened by God, and there'll be a Messiah who will come and he'll liberate the people of Israel. Okay, well, it's a long way from the vision of Moses and the land of promise. And that's what Jesus says. The end of the world is at hand. Turn the other cheek, right? And if you preach, he says to his disciples, if you preach my gospel in a city and they won't listen to you, leave them behind and shake the dust off your coats. And it'll be worse for those people on the day of judgment, which is at hand, than it was for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's the Jesus of the New Testament. The end of the world's at hand, and there'll be a fearful judgment. The book of the Apocalypse is about the world being turned upside down by the second coming. And then, of course, there will be a millennium. That's the reality of the Bible. That's what they're really talking about. All right. So the Jews have been debating forever. What's the truth? How do we make sense of the world? What is the law? How do you apply it? Are we righteous? All right. And they have a very hard time with it, because their biggest rebellions were against the Romans, and the Romans were not to be trifled with, and they crushed the Jewish rebellions brutally, ruthlessly, destroyed Jerusalem. So you've got the Jewish diaspora. In the diaspora, what holds the Jewish community together? Rabbinical Judaism, this extraordinary literary document, interpretation, Kabbalah, secret mysticism. The world's baffling, but it must make sense. Let's talk about the secret and inscrutable ways in which it does. That's Judaism. All right. Now, you get to the 18th century in Europe, and an increasing number of Jews are saying, actually, we rather like what we're seeing in the European Enlightenment, more open, more secular, more tolerant world. And so they move away from Orthodox Judaism, right? But they bring with them the habits of debate and the interpretation of obscure secrets and complex books. And that gives Jewish intellectual culture in the world of the modern Enlightenment an unusual edge. Why is it that there are so many brilliant Jewish philosophers, novelists, musicians, scientists, etc.? It's that intellectual culture. All right? So I find that history really interesting. And I think if we set ourselves free from dogmatic Catholicism, then similar kinds of virtues could be obtained from the Catholic tradition, with which I flatter myself I'm perfectly conversant, right? But I don't believe the dogmas any more than, Moses Mendelssohn believed Orthodox Judaism.
But I don't think anyone should believe any dogma.
Right, but if you don't believe any dogma, then how do religious institutions arise or persist? If as indeed has happened in wide swathes of the Catholic world since the Second Vatican Council, a whole bunch of people say, so the gospel is not about the doctrines of the church, it's not about papal authority, it's not about miracles or virgin births or transubstantiation, it's about being good and loving and forgiving people in the actual world. Well, so they walk out of their religious orders in droves from the 60s and 70s on. Vocations just stop in the Western world, right, for practical purposes. And a lot of people stop going to church because they think it's all just ritual and a waste of time. All right. There are interesting things to do. There are more practical things to do. There are charitable and visionary things to do. So many of them become secular activists, or they say to themselves, as some of my family have, I'm a Catholic, but the Pope's not. Because it's easier for them to think that their behaviours and beliefs are continuous with the tradition and the gospel than to accept that actually they're walking away from it all. Because you don't need to be a Catholic to be a good and thoughtful person, right? It may or may not help, but it's certainly not a necessary condition. And above all, as I think we discussed recently, the Catholic Church does in fact explicitly teach transubstantiation and the virgin birth and the second coming, and it teaches explicitly in its official catechism that there must have been the fall of man, of Adam and Eve, because if there hadn't been, it wouldn't have been necessary for Jesus to come and save us. And since the whole religion pivots on the idea that that is what happened, that Jesus is the Son of God, and he did come to save us and died on the cross and rose from the dead, if that wasn't necessary, well, then the show's over. So there must have been a fall. It's totally circular reasoning. It's dogmatic, insular thinking, and it's got no foundation in reality.
I struggle to believe anyone who's spent time thinking about it would really believe that.
And yet that's what the church teaches, so they're not thought about it in all these centuries.
I don't think they think that, is what I'm saying. And that's what I think I told you, that I had the prep teacher who told us at a Catholic school, Adam and Eve aren't real, it's a story to teach us something, and it is.
Yes, but if we say, and let me say we've digressed here greatly because we were talking about China and analysis of China. I don't know how we got to this, but just to wrap that thought around, if in fact there was general acceptance that the Bible, to say nothing of Catholic dogma, that the Bible is just a set of old books like the Homeric myths. It's not the same as the Homeric myths, but it has the same status as the Homeric myths. It's a classical text which we can read as a set of stories, some of which we find amazing, some of which we find strange, some of which we find stirring, and some of which we find just unintelligible. The code of law in Deuteronomy, for example, that adulterers or homosexuals should be stoned to death. And so we would surely read that now and think, no, it's barbarous. If we're told, but that's the word of God, well, we've got a problem. And if we say it's not only the word of God, it is enforced by institutions that claim to be acting in his name, as it was the truth for hundreds of years, then we've got a problem. So if we're going to liberate ourselves from that, it's not sufficient if you have a dominant church to simply say, oh no, that's an old book. You risk being burned at the stake as a heretic if you do that. Until we set ourselves free from dogmatic Christianity, that took a lot of hard work. All right, and for the church to say, we've always been about the evangel, that's frankly a lie. It's frankly a lie. It's as if communists were to say, communism's always been benign and egalitarian. Rubbish. It's been deeply and brutally oppressive.
But can't you take the good thing? So my point is about seeing the good things about religion. So it's like a place for people to come together. It's something, me and my friends who are like we kind of like, okay, we don't want to drink as much anymore. Like, what should we do on the weekends? And literally a couple of the girls like, should we start going to church? Like, just to see each other, like, because otherwise it's like, okay, go to a yoga class together. So it's like a way of, let's do something together. So if you can see, okay, I want to do something charitable, I want to, hand out food to the poor, which a couple of my friends do through this church in London. It's like, okay, these churches are still a way to do charity, to like come together, to meet, to be part of a community, that to even sing and do those kinds of things. So it's like, these are good things.
Yes.
And it's interesting about you saying Hinduism as a religion, because when I was just in India, multiple people told me this, like, Hinduism isn't a religion, it's the people. They are Hindus, and it means it's a way of life, like believing in karma and, okay, live in this certain way, have these rituals, but it's not a dogmatic. Burn
widows on their husbands' funeral pyres and so on. Religions are a mixed bag, and it's certainly the case, if you go back to the roots of religion and of Christianity not least, right, that a lot of it does have to do with community, with the desire for an alternative space in which to live and breathe and hope, right? That's perfectly clear. And one good reason to read Hegel, for example, right? Georg Hegel, the 18th century German philosopher, is that he attempts to say, rather than just rejecting religion, how do we make sense of it in the context of overall human cultural development, right? And he says, well, it's dialectical, so a lot of stuff takes place which we would say, well, we don't believe that, but we can understand why it occurred, what it means, how it fits in, how things have changed, right? And his phenomenology of spirit, and he talks about the development of human consciousness. And so what you're saying about places where people can gather and find common space or a sense of community, that's perfectly real and it's very healthy, and we need that in various ways. The difficulty, the tension is when organised religion says this is the way, which it generally does. How do we handle that? And many of the Christian sects clearly have been formed by people wanting a dissenting community, free from mainstream organised Christianity, but then all too often they themselves become intensely, coercively dogmatic, right? How do individuals who were raised in that fight their way free of it? If you're a Mormon, an Amish, a Seventh-day Adventist, this is a chronic problem, all right? But it can be a problem in any form of human community. It can be a problem in a family,
It could be a problem with someone listening to this podcast, listening to you speak and saying, I'm a follower of Paul, and then anything you say, they say, no, well, Paul says this, but you might say, hang on, I don't want you to blindly follow, I can change my mind, and
yes.
5 years ago I said that, but please make up your own mind.
Yes, the philosophically, and this is the difference I would suggest between a philosophical and a religious disposition. The philosophical disposition is that it's about method rather than charisma or authority. Above all, about method rather than authority. So how do we think clearly and formulate opinions that are warranted, that are examinable, and that can change if we learn more? That's philosophy, right? What's the revealed truth that we must cling to by our teeth? That's religion, all right? What would motivate one to go out and preach to the whole world at risk and life and limb that the Saviour has come and will return? Well, that's religion. It has nothing to do with free thought. You have to be at liberty to do that, or you have to be very brave or reckless to do it in the face of an authority that says you can't, right? And martyrs do that, right? Do we admire them? Well, we're encouraged to from inside a believing community, but from a certain point of view, they're irrational fanatics, all right? And so there's a line to be drawn, and it's uncertain where precisely to draw it in any given individual case. But if one asks, for example, the difference between, well, take an almost cliched example, between Socrates and Jesus. Right? So Socrates simply asked questions. When people say, so what's the truth? He said, well, I don't know, but you're telling me you know what the truth is, and when I ask you to demonstrate that you know the truth, it seems you can't, so maybe neither of us know. That's freedom of inquiry. When Jesus apparently says, or encourages his disciples to say, and leaves things a bit ambiguous, that he's the one who's been anointed, appointed, waited for, the Messiah, that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, tells economic parables that people have repeated ever since. And we keep discussing them because we're not clear in many cases what they mean. That's religion. It's obscure, it's mystical, it's not the same. There's no method, there's mystification and vision. I think I've made as good faith and effort as one reasonably could to understand religion, particularly Christianity, since I was raised a Christian and I'm a citizen of the West. But in the same way that I've made a good faith effort to understand many of the great philosophers, and it doesn't mean that in any given case I say, I believe this person's teaching. I've read what they've had to say, I've learned a few things along the way, and I keep learning and making up my mind. It seems to be what a mature, free individual will do. How do such individuals then, just to the extent that they're free, come together to form effective communities, political parties, whatever? Well, that's a challenge. So you form a political party let's say, the Liberal Party, right? And the idea is that it will be a broad church. We say church, right? Broad church. There'll be a variety of opinions, and that's fine because we're Liberals. We believe in a variety of opinions, but we'll collaborate to conduct political campaigns and try to lead the country, in the direction that we see fit. Does that work? Well, to some extent. Is it perfect? No, far from it. Is the Liberal Party a perfect instantiation of liberty, free thought, constructive policy? No. Is there a better alternative? Perhaps. Right? But there's no cut and dry. There's no dogma that one can say, there's the truth. That's absolutely clear. All right?
Yeah, and that's how I see spirituality, which is, let's explore. There are things that we don't know, and we can have experiences that feel like you can't explain it rationally. And then the world I've kind of been exposed to, or what I've read and other people have found and taught, and that's why particularly I like Buddhism, because it's like not you have to go somewhere, it's like it's within you, it's inside, and then you can take teachings of Jesus which say the same thing, and like Eckhart Tolle puts these all together and says, here the Buddha's saying this, Jesus is saying this, all these other great thinkers are saying this, and then I've had glimpses of that, freeing myself from my own, like, because when you view it as like that, how I'm having a miserable time in this experience on earth, how can I free myself from this? And then that can kind of show some guideposts, and then things like psychedelics and experiencing, feeling something different and then exploring, but and even meditation, all these things. I don't know if it's the way I think or if that's how the world really is. It seems that spiritual world, it's like take what resonates with you, reject whatever else. But it's about you experiencing this. It's about you sitting in meditation.
But that's to some extent what people have done for the longest time, but it's more possible and more necessary in a liberal and open society. If we lived in the Middle Ages, where there's a very dominant and intrusive orthodoxy, and where you're literally risking life and limb to openly say, well, I don't believe that, I'm going to be a Buddhist, or I'm going to be a Muslim, or I'm going to be a free thinker, then it's much tougher. And if you live in a period before there's even a printing press, it's hard to even get access to books enable you to think through, what do I believe and who's been here before, right? So the paradox, it seems to me, of the 21st century is that in much of the world, certainly in the Western world, we have greater liberty, greater access to information, greater freedom of choice, greater physical well-being, prosperity, opportunity than pretty much any other epoch in history. But it can be bewildering because we've got such a menu of choices. We flounder around and try to figure out, what should I do? And life seems short, it's whizzing by. How do I even make choices? How do I make them stick? But that doesn't mean that people in any identifiable epoch in the past were better off because things were simpler. Life was tough, right? It was shorter. It was more endangered by disease, by violence. Far more people were poor. And so, as I think I said in my first interview, I think we need to be realistic enough to say that there is no guarantee that things will work out, not for us as individuals, not for us collectively. We're at risk, as we are when we drive on the roads, of accident. We get cleaned up and crippled or killed on the road, not through our own fault. Just happens. Is there a reason for that? Well, it's a systemic explanation causally, but it's not consoling. Is there evidence in that of some benign will that's guiding our destiny? Absolutely not. All right. So how do we cope? Well, it's challenging. We try and climb Mount Everest, we're George Mallory and Sandy Irvine, and we fall, we die. But we attempted it. That's living.
But I think it's like the utility of using it. Yeah, there's someone who really enjoyed your the first podcast we did together. He thinks a lot about like the utility of religion. So if you are in this car accident and you're crippled, and it's like, what's the point? If you say, hang on, it will help me move forward with my life if I decide there is a point to this.
Mm.
So it's like, by deciding that, you get a better outcome, because the alternative is like nihilism, and then you think, well, what's the point in even being here? There's no point. And
but notice what you've just said. If you decide, right, then you give meaning to your life, right? So it takes character, it takes resilience to say, despite this, whatever it might be, a car accident, a divorce, a shooting, disease, I'm not giving up, right? How is it that human beings as a species have evolved to become masters of the planet? For all that that entails, including the spoliation and danger that we're in. Because we're an incredibly resilient species. We came close to extinction, right, during the Ice Age. We squeaked through. Every other hominin species and most primate species are already extinct. They didn't make it through, all right? Pachyderms, right? There are elephants now and they're vanishing. Every other pachyderm, the mammoths, etc., the mastodons, are all gone. Right? Species die out. Almost all species that ever existed, plant, animal on the planet, are gone and never come back, right? Unless, of course, we start tinkering with DNA and bring some back, and who knows what that'll cause, right? So in other words, the lesson of life on Earth is there isn't any plan, any benign destiny, any nirvana that's waiting for us. And we can't afford to be passive and think it'll all just work out. We can sit and meditate to become calm, but if we're not in action soon, the world falls apart around us, all right? And if it's not falling apart around us, it's a constant challenge. And even if everything works out, we keep our health, we're not killed on the road, we make a pile of money, we have a happy marriage, we have kids, we grow old and die, and our kids might turn out badly. Our partner might go stranger on us and divorce or have an affair. And that's the way life is, all right? And we shouldn't pretend otherwise, which is not to say we should be all gloomy and cynical. It's to say that's the way life is, and it's a challenge. If you're an elite sportsman, if you're an AFL player, right, you have to work very hard to make the team. Most people who aspire don't make it, and we don't even hear about most of them. Those who make the teams work very hard as a unit to win games, and they can have a really good season and lose a grand final by a point. What do they then do? They say, well, failures. Well, they could, but that's not very useful, is it? Right? What are you going to do then? Abandon your career? Or become demoralised and do worse the next year? No, you say, we're going to climb the mountain again. Right? Is there any guarantee you'll win the next year? No. That's the way life is. Right? And so we feel exhilaration when we succeed because it's hard. We feel amazed when we find real love because it's actually rare. We feel astonished when we, under happy circumstances, give birth to a child with somebody we love, because it's amazing, no matter that in a sense it's perfectly banal, because creatures get born to every species all the time. But for us to create new life, wow, you know. And we're, in a sense, we're biologically programmed that way. Right? Why is it that parenting is almost instinctual? It can go terribly wrong, but you know, they say, for example, I have a good friend who said this when his own daughter was an infant, that he had discovered that, contrary to what you might think as a single person, when you have a baby, you discover that its shit doesn't stink because it's your baby, right? So biological life is amazing. The complexity of human civilization is astonishing. And life's dangerous and uncertain.
Okay.
Is that a good note to end?
Yes. Sorry, we went so far off topic. But I think
we sort of did two in one, didn't we? I think we pretty much covered the territory on China and defence. Maybe we could have dwelt on it, but we covered the ground. We did the vetting, we did the job I got and what it was like to be in DIO, and then I walked away because they wouldn't develop me, right? And somehow we segued to Judaism.
Okay. Is there, maybe can we finish with, because my friend was interested in learning about what else you've read that's had a really big impact on you?
Well, there's a great deal, of course. The question would be what to select that would make sense rather than just jumping all over the place, right? And one path into that, it seems to me, would be, in our previous interview we finished when you asked me, what in 3 words would be the way you would most want to show up, and I said the address that Rachel uses, my lovely poet. So why would that be? What have I read that's had me think that occurring as a lovely poet is a great way to be? That sort of conversation. But we could have that conversation, record it now. It could be 2 separate podcasts if you like, because we've been going at this now for a couple of hours. So you could break this in 2.
Well, let's wrap this one up. So if there's anything else you want to add to the end of this?
Yeah, I would just say, because perhaps we didn't entirely cover it, just going back to this question of China, and it links, at least indirectly, to our other theme about meaning in life and purposes. So I had been treated in a bizarre way when applying to work in defence. The clearances were just a crazy process, but I got through. I was then refused permission, tacitly, to work on the United States, which is what I specialised in, but assigned to East Asia. And I saw that as an opportunity. I threw myself into it. I do very well. I get promoted to head the China desk, and then they won't develop me, despite the fact that it's acknowledged I'm really good at what I do. That was profoundly frustrating. As we said in the previous interview, it led for a little while to me hitting a wall. I thought, I just cannot seem to get a break. And yet here I am. All right, so what's the lesson in that existentially? Well, I don't want to be too glib about it, but it turns out, in retrospect, that having had that job, even though I failed to find a way forward directly, has, over the last generation, given me a lot of street cred. Because if you've been head of the China Desk in Defence Intelligence, a lot of people in public, in the media, think, well, you must know what you're talking about. And let me say quite frankly that I know many other people who had similar positions in defence and foreign affairs, and they really didn't know what they were talking about. So it doesn't fall from the fact that you've got a senior job that you know what you're doing, right? But I flatter myself that I did, and paradoxically that's one reason why they didn't develop me, because too many bureaucrats were afraid that I couldn't be controlled, right? I was my own man, I had my own mind, and yet, as I said, here I am. So what I've done since is I have exercised my own mind. I've continued to read and inquire, to think freely, and to write and speak freely, and it's because I've done those things that background has come to fruition, right? That I wrote a book about China. It's about to be reissued in a 2nd edition, which has been strongly vindicated by what's happened since it was first published almost 20 years ago. That I'm on radio and TV talking about China, and it's not only a broad, let's say, largely ignorant public that takes me seriously. The best China scholars in the country and the foreign diplomats and the people at its highest cabinet take me seriously for what I say. Given the background, given the refusal of the government to develop me at all, the refusal of DFAT to have me at all, I've got to say that's profoundly satisfying. But not in a conceited way. It's a bit of a revelation about the nature of freedom, of inquiry, of self-expression, of an open society. That's what's really at issue here, right? I have had to invent myself as a member of such a society. I've had to take advantage of its liberties. I've had to scrap and scrape and dig deep. And what you find if you do that, and you don't fall off the mountain, is that life at a rarefied height is amazing. All right? And I could have done a George Mallory. I could have fallen off the mountain top short of the peak. All right? I could have died of cancer years ago. I lucked out. I'm still here, and I'm still climbing.
Great. Lovely way to end it. Thanks for coming on again.
Shall we get a cup of tea?